I begin by cutting two types of contrasting steel into 4-inch sections. These will be stacked, welded, and forged in a way that will create a unique pattern on the finished knife. Each piece needs to be carefully cleaned to ensure a flawless weld. As I begin to stack the steel, I alternate the layers to create a flowy gradient pattern in the metal. I begin with 1 piece of steel 1, then 6 pieces of steel 2. Then do 2 layers of steel 1, then 5 of steel 2. 3, then 4, and so on and so forth until I have 6 pieces of steel 1 and 1 of steel 2. This makes the pattern a little more unique than a traditional 1-to-1 alteration. I use the MIG welder to hold everything in place before forge welding. Getting to weld is one of my most favorite parts of this whole process. I dunk the billet in some oil to protect the steel from oxygen as it heats. You can see some of that burn off here as I place the billet in the forge. After soaking in the forge for about a half hour, I squish the steel under my 25-ton press to bond everything together. I begin to draw out the billet into a rectangle that I can cut into equal pieces. This will increase the layer count and create a finer pattern. Watching the press do its job and seeing how the steel moves is just such a satisfying thing to watch. With the billet forged out, I grind the forge scale off the bar and cut it into 5 pieces. I once again ensure each piece is free from any scale or impurities, then tack them together with the welder. Then back in the forge for another round of forge welding. This time I'll forge the bar into a square instead of a rectangle. Then I forge in the corners to make a new square. This distorts the layers and makes them run diagonally in the bar. Next, I turn the bar and flatten it on a corner. This compresses the layers and makes a C shape. In case you're having a hard time envisioning how the steel is distorted, here's a drawing by Mareko Mausi who created this pattern. It gives a rough overview of each step of this process and shows how the layers of the steel change shape with each subsequent step. Now the bar is forged out into a rectangle to be cut and restacked again. Now it's grind, weld, heat, and repeat. This cycle of forging is done exactly like the last. I'm going to draw the billet out into a square, knock in the corners, forge down on one corner, and forge the bar into a rectangle to be cut into equal pieces again. With this being the final forge weld, I surface grind all the pieces to ensure they weld together flawlessly. I flip every other piece of steel so the layers flow nicely together in somewhat of an S shape. I gently set the weld. Since the pattern is located at the ends of the billet, I cut the handle off so I can begin drawing it out into a usable size for a knife. This is a gentle process. The press is capable of doing this much quicker, but I risk blowing apart the welds by squeezing material too far too fast. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast here. I use the hand hammer to shape the steel slightly in order to preserve some material. I don't want to forge the shape too closely here because I don't want the pattern to get distorted too much. Quick adjustment in the vise and some straightening and the forging's done. Next, I trace the outline of my design and begin to rough in the shape of the knife. In order to preserve some material for a future knife, I cut the tang area short and will weld on a mild steel extension. This might seem unconventional, however proper technique, root gap, and weld settings will have this joint stronger than it needs to be. I cut the areas to be welded at an angle. This increases the surface area of the weld, and in return, it makes it stronger. You'll also see the root gap I create instead of welding the pieces perfectly flush together. This is a technique I learned while working in a collision shop, and that gap helps ensure the weld fully penetrates into the material. I clean the freshly joined pieces up on the grinder, and as you can see, the weld is clean and unnoticeable. Next, I rough grind the knife and get it ready for heat treat. Heat treat begins with 3 normalizing cycles. This refines the molecular grain of the steel and relieves any internal stresses. I preheat my oil before hardening. Heated oil cools more efficiently than cold oil because of its lower viscosity. After the quench, it's into the oven for 2 cycles of tempering at 375 degrees. This brings back the hardness of the blade and makes it less brittle. After heat treat, I surface grind the knife so I have a precise surface to lay out my grind lines on the granite block. This center line is important for both the aesthetics and the performance of the finished knife. I roughen the bevels with a coarse 50 grit belt. Once everything is close to where it needs to be, I switch to a 120 grit belt to refine it even more. The final grinding is done with 220 grit on my disc sander. The disc makes the bevels super flat and precise, which helps with the function of the knife as well as make hand sanding even easier. Once I have the bevels complete, I move on to finishing the spine and edges of the knife. I use various attachments on the grinder and work my way up to 400 grit on these areas. The final step before hand finishing is to flatten the shoulders so the knife will sit against the handle material. To do this, I use a precisely machined clamp that has carbide surfaces that allow me to grind both sides flat and parallel to each other. I once again finish this on the disc since it's a more precise surface to grind on. Next, it's on to hand sanding up to 400 grit. I like to use stick-on sandpaper for this process. A lot of people like to use long strips of steel they wrap around their sanding stick. I find that wrapping paper like this has too much give and in return washes out any crisp grind lines you might have. My sanding stick is a surface ground bar of steel, so that in conjunction with the stick-on paper helps me keep my grinds flat and crisp. This is a long, boring process. Next, I use my electrochemical etcher to put my mark in the blade. Essentially, I'm using electricity, salt water, and a custom stencil to etch into the metal. I clean this up with a few finishing passes of hand sanding, then clean the blade before the first etch. I let the knife soak in ferric chloride for about 10 minutes, then remove it and sand off the oxides with 1000 grit sandpaper. Since I used two different types of contrasting steel in this build, one steel has a higher nickel content than the other. When it goes into the acid, it resists the etching more than the steel without the nickel content. This is what creates the pattern in the blade, and why one steel is darker and the other remains lighter. This gives me a basic finish that I can begin handle shaping with. For the handle, I'm using a stabilized piece of spalted maple that I got when I was attending Blade Show a couple years back. Stabilized means the piece of wood is soaked in a resin-filled vacuum chamber for a prolonged period of time. This fills any pores and voids in the wood. It creates a more denser, durable, and water-resistant product. I cut the rough outline on the bandsaw, then refine it further on the grinder. Next, I lay out the knife and trace where I want the slot to be for the tang. Then I carefully mark and drill into the material. Next, I use a broach, which is basically a jigsaw blade attached to a tool handle. This saws the holes I drilled together and squares up the slot so the tang will fit. With the handle fit up, I take the pieces over to the granite block and lay out some center and thickness lines. I like my handles to be slim. I think it both looks and feels good that way. So I'll start by grinding the block down to around 5/8 of an inch thick. You can see how sleek it looks thinned down. My classic style lately has been adding a groove down the center of my handles. This feels great in the hand, especially when using a knife in a pinch grip, and makes the knife more fun to look at. With the groove in, I begin to shape and round out the corners. I start with the flat platen, then use what's called a rotary platen. The rotary platen has a flexible rubber belt that allows some give to create rounded facets without washing out some of the crisp lines I created. I take the handles to 400 grit on the grinder, then hand finish to 600. I finish it off on the buffer, and the handle is complete. Now I'll finish out the blade. I begin by resanding it at 800 grit. This helps to get any tiny scrapes or scratches out that may have happened while making the handle. Then I clean, etch, and sand off the oxides with 1500 grit. I do this a total of 3 times. For the final etch, I use a product called Gator Piss. I find it works really well to give a nicely contrasting finish straight out of the etch without needing any cleanup. With the knife and handle finished, I clean and degrease everything and glue them together. I use G-Flex epoxy, which is the best of the best. It's strong and waterproof, and I've literally smashed apart handle blocks trying to remove them before. For added security, I cut small grooves in the tang, which will give me even more surface area for the epoxy to grab into. I clamp it up, then clean all the excessive epoxy before it dries. With everything dried overnight, I add a protective layer of wax to the entire knife using a product called Wicked Wax. It's soft and applied easily, then dries hard for a more durable finish than oil. And that's a wrap. I'm super happy with how this knife turned out. I will have it available on my website by the time this video posts. I'll also be making a leather blade cover for it, which will be posted in another video soon.